I've got you. I won't let go.
Titanic was called, and it was. It really was.
Give me your hand. Do you trust me?
I trust you.
You never know what hand you're gonna get dealt next. To make each
Welcome to Z Cineplex, say your ultimate entertainment destination. Welcome to Z Cineplex, the home of entertainment, creativity, and cinematic excitement. Our channel is dedicated to bringing viewers a rich collection of engaging content that celebrates the world of movies, storytelling, and visual entertainment. Whether you're a passionate film enthusiast, someone who enjoys discovering new cinematic experiences, or simply looking for high-quality entertainment, Z Cineplex is designed to be your go-to destination. We strive to create content that is informative, enjoyable, and engaging for audiences of all ages, offering a unique blend of movie-related features, entertainment updates, insightful discussions, creative videos, and much more. Every upload is crafted with attention to quality, ensuring that our viewers receive an enjoyable experience that keeps them coming back for more. At Z Cineplex, we believe that cinema is more than just watching films. It's about experiencing emotions, exploring stories, appreciating creativity, and connecting with people who share the same passion for entertainment. Our mission is to build a vibrant community where movie lovers and entertainment enthusiasts can discover exciting content, share their opinions, and stay connected with the latest trends in the entertainment industry. We are committed to consistently improving our content, embracing new ideas, and delivering videos that entertain, inform, and inspire our growing audience. Whether you're here for movie highlights, entertainment discussions, reviews, cinematic moments, or fresh creative content, Z Cineplex promises an enjoyable journey filled with excitement, quality, and unforgettable entertainment. Join our community by subscribing, turning on notifications, and becoming part of the Z Cineplex family as we continue to explore the fascinating world of cinema and entertainment together. Thank you for your support, and welcome to Z Cineplex, wherever video brings entertainment to life. Titanic is a 1997 American epic historical romance and disaster film written and directed by James Cameron, combining fictional characters and a central love story with the real historical events surrounding the maiden voyage and sinking of the RMS Titanic in April 1912. The film stars Leonardo Dicaprio as Jack Dawson, an impoverished and free-spirited young artist, and Kate Winslet as Rose the Wit Bucator, an upper-class young woman traveling aboard the Titanic who feels trapped by the rigid expectations imposed on her by her family and social position. Their relationship develops aboard the supposedly unsinkable ocean liner despite the enormous social and economic differences separating them. The principal ensemble cast includes Billy Zane as Rose's wealthy and possessive fiancé Dicaprio, Caledon Hackley, Kathy Bates as the outspoken and socially progressive first-class passenger Margaret Malley Brown, Frances Fisher as Rose's status-conscious mother Ruth the Wit Bucator, Bernard Hill as Captain Edward Smith, Jonathan Hyde as White Star Line Managing Director J. Bruce Ismay, Danny Nucci as Jack's friend Fabrizio de Rossi, David Warner as Rose's sympathetic first-class acquaintance Spicer Lovejoy, and Gloria Stewart as the elderly Rose, who narrates the events from the perspective of decades after the disaster. Bill Paxton portrays Brock Lovett, a modern-day treasure hunter whose search for the valuable heart of the ocean diamond provides the framing device for the story. The film begins in the modern day, when Lovett and his team are exploring the wreck of the Titanic in the North Atlantic in search of the heart of the ocean, a valuable diamond believed to have been carried aboard the ship. During their expedition, They discover a drawing of a young woman wearing the diamond and eventually meet an elderly woman who identifies herself as Rose Dawson Culvert. Rose reveals that she is the woman depicted in the drawing and begins recounting her experiences aboard the Titanic in 1912. Her recollections transport the story back to the ship's maiden voyage, where the young Rose is introduced as a first-class passenger traveling with her mother Ruth and her wealthy fiancé Dicaprio, California. Although she has been raised in an affluent environment, Rose feels suffocated by the expectations of high society and resents being forced into a marriage designed primarily to preserve her family's financial and social standing. In despair over her future, she considers taking her own life by jumping from the stern of the ship, but she is stopped by Jack Dawson, a third-class passenger and aspiring artist who has won his ticket aboard the Titanic in a poker game shortly before departure. Jack and Rose gradually develop a close friendship that evolves into a passionate romance. Their relationship allows Rose to experience a sense of independence and freedom that she has been denied by her privileged upbringing. Jack introduces her to the more spontaneous and less restrictive world of the third-class passengers, while Rose begins challenging the conventions governing her life in first class. Despite their different social backgrounds, the two become deeply attached to one another. Rose's relationship with Jack increasingly brings her into conflict with Gal, who becomes jealous and suspicious of their growing intimacy. Rose's mother also attempts to separate them, emphasizing the family's financial difficulties and insisting that Rose marry Cal to secure their future. Meanwhile, Jack's presence gives Rose the courage to reject the expectations imposed upon her and imagine a life based on her own choices rather than social obligation. The romantic storyline unfolds against the increasingly ominous background of the Titanic's voyage. The ship, operated by the White Star Line and widely regarded as one of the largest and most luxurious vessels ever constructed, is traveling across the North Atlantic on its maiden voyage from Southampton to New York. Cameron recreates the ship's elaborate first-class interiors, grand staircase, dining rooms, cabins, corridors, and third-class accommodations to emphasize the enormous differences between passengers according to wealth and social status. The film also incorporates real historical figures and events, including Captain Edward Smith, J. Bruce Ismay, Thomas Andrews, and Margaret Brown. Although many of the central characters and their relationships are fictional, the surrounding historical circumstances are closely connected to the actual disaster. On the night of April 14, 1912, the Titanic strikes an iceberg in the North Atlantic after receiving warnings about ice in the ship's path. The collision causes severe structural damage beneath the waterline, allowing seawater to flood multiple watertight compartments. As the crew gradually realizes that the damage is catastrophic and that the ship cannot remain afloat, the atmosphere aboard the vessel changes from confidence and celebration to confusion, fear, and desperation. Cameron's depiction emphasizes the contrast between the orderly luxury of the earlier voyage and the growing chaos as passengers struggle to understand the seriousness of the situation. Captain Smith and the ship's officers begin preparations to evacuate passengers into lifeboats, but the Titanic carries far more people than the available lifeboats can accommodate. As the evacuation begins, social divisions become increasingly significant. First-class passengers generally receive greater access to lifeboats, while many second- and third-class passengers face delays and obstacles in reaching the boat deck. Rose, however, refuses to abandon Jack, who has been falsely accused of stealing the heart of the ocean after Cal attempts to frame him. With the ship rapidly deteriorating, Jack and Rose fight their way through increasingly dangerous sections of the vessel while trying to escape. Their journey through the sinking ship becomes one of the film's central action sequences, combining large-scale disaster spectacle with the emotional development of their relationship. The ship's bow gradually sinks deeper into the ocean, causing its stern to rise dramatically before the vessel eventually breaks apart and plunges beneath the surface. During the final stages of the disaster, Jack and Rose reach the freezing Atlantic Ocean. Rose manages to climb onto a piece of floating wreckage large enough to keep her partially above the water, While Jack remains in the ICC beside her, Jack encourages Rose to survive and repeatedly reminds her that she must continue living her life rather than surrendering to despair. As the survivors are eventually rescued by the RMS Carpathia, Rose is left mourning Jack, who dies from exposure in the freezing water. Before his death, Jack makes Rose promise that she will survive, grow old, and live a full life. Rose keeps that promise, allowing the story to transform from a tragic romance into one of survival, personal liberation, and remembrance. The narrative then returns to the elderly Rose in the modern day. She explains that she ultimately escaped the restrictive future that had been planned for her, adopted the name Rose Dawson for a time, and built a life independent of her former social identity. She never returned to her old life with Callan, instead pursued many of the experiences she and Jack had once imagined. After finishing her story, Rose reveals that she has kept the memory of Jack alive throughout her life. She later possesses the heart of the ocean, which had been recovered from the wreckage without the knowledge of Lovett and his team. Rather than selling it, she drops the diamond into the ocean, symbolically returning it to the place where her memories of Jack and the Titanic began. Cameron conceived Titanic from his long-standing fascination with shipwrecks and the Titanic disaster. He believed that a fictional romance would provide an emotional framework through which audiences could experience the enormous human tragedy of the historical sinking. The production combined extensive physical sets, large-scale miniatures, practical effects, computer-generated imagery, underwater photography, and historically researched production designed to recreate the ship and its destruction. Cameron personally participated in expeditions to the Titanic wreck aboard the Russian research vessel Akademik Mstislav Kaldych, using footage and observations from the wreck to increase the authenticity of the film. Principal production began in the mid-1990s, with the modern-day wreck sequences filmed before the historical sections. A massive reconstruction of the Titanic was built at Baja Studios in Mexico, while detailed sets and scale models were used alongside digital effects to portray the ship at sea and during its final hours. The production became one of the most ambitious and expensive filmmaking projects of its era. Initially developed by 20th Century Fox, the film encountered escalating costs and production challenges, eventually leading Fox to partner with Paramount Pictures for financing and distribution. The estimated production budget reached approximately $200 million, making Titanic the most expensive film ever produced at the time. Principal photography continued through 1996 and into 1997, and the demanding production schedule, extensive sets, elaborate water sequences, special effects, and large-scale recreation of the ship generated considerable concern within the film industry about whether the project could recover its enormous investment. Despite these concerns, Cameron remained committed to creating a historically immersive disaster film that combined spectacle with an emotionally accessible human story. Titanic premiered at the Tokyo International Film Festival on November 1, 1997. Before receiving its United States theatrical release on December 19, 1997. Paramount Pictures distributed the film in the United States and Canada, while 20th Century Fox handled distribution in many international territories. Upon release, the film received widespread critical acclaim for its direction, cinematography, production design, visual effects, performances, musical score, emotional impact, and recreation of the Titanic disaster. Particular praise was directed toward Leonardo Dicaprio and Kate Winslet for their chemistry and performances, while Gloria Stewart's portrayal of elderly Rose was also widely acclaimed. James Horner's score, including the internationally successful song My Heart Will Go On performed by Celine Dion, became one of the defining musical elements associated with the film. The film became an extraordinary commercial phenomenon. Its initial worldwide theatrical run generated more than $1.84 billion, making it the highest-grossing film of 1997 and the first motion picture to surpass $1 billion at the worldwide box office. Titanic remained the highest-grossing film in history until Cameron's Avatar surpassed it in 2010. Subsequent theatrical re-releases, including major anniversary restorations and premium format presentations, significantly increased its lifetime worldwide theatrical total to approximately $2.26 billion, making it the second film after Avatar to surpass $2 billion worldwide at the time. Its continued success across home video, soundtrack sales, television rights, and later theatrical releases further demonstrated its extraordinary cultural and commercial longevity. At the 70th Academy Awards, Titanic received 14 nominations, tying the record previously established by All About Eve for the most Oscar nominations received by a film at the time. It won 11 Academy Awards, including Best Picture, Best Director, Best Cinematography, Best Art Direction, Best Costume Design, Best Film Editing, Best Original Score, Best Original Song, Best Sound, Best Sound Effects Editing, and Best Visual Effects. Its 11 victories tied Ben-Hur for the record for the most Academy Awards won by a single film, a record that remained highly significant in Academy history. The film's success extended beyond the Oscars, with numerous additional awards and honors recognizing its technical achievements, performances, direction, music, and overall cultural impact. Over the decades following its release, Titanic has remained one of the most influential and recognizable films in modern popular culture. Its combination of historical tragedy, romance, spectacle, and technical innovation helped establish it as a defining blockbuster of the late 1990s. The film's depiction of the Titanic disaster introduced a new generation of viewers to one of the most famous maritime tragedies in history while transforming Jack and Rose into enduring fictional characters associated with the event. The film has also continued to benefit from technological restorations and theatrical re-releases, allowing audiences to experience Cameron's visual effects and large-scale production design in increasingly sophisticated formats. In 2017, on the 20th anniversary of its original release, Titanic was selected by the Library of Congress for preservation in the United States National Film Registry for being deemed culturally, historically, or aesthetically significant. Its continued presence in the registry reflects the film's importance not only as a commercially successful blockbuster but also as a major work of American popular cinema. More than 2 decades after its original theatrical release, Titanic remains a landmark achievement in filmmaking, remembered for its epic reconstruction of a historical disaster, its fictional love story between Jack and Rose, its groundbreaking visual effects, its emotional storytelling, and its extraordinary impact on global cinema and popular culture. In 1996, treasure hunter Brock Lovett and his team conduct an expedition aboard the Russian research vessel Akademik Mstislav Kaldish to explore the wreck of the RMS Titanic, which lies on the floor of the North Atlantic. Their primary objective is to locate the heart of the ocean, a legendary and extremely valuable blue diamond necklace believed to have been aboard the ship when it sank in 1912. Instead of finding the necklace, the expedition recovers a safe from the wreck. Inside the safe is an old drawing depicting a young woman wearing the heart of the ocean. The drawing is dated April 14, 1912, the night the Titanic struck an iceberg and sank during its maiden voyage, killing approximately 1,500 people. After the discovery is publicized on television, an elderly woman named Rose Dawson Calvert contacts Lovett and claims that she is the young woman portrayed in the drawing. Intrigued by her extraordinary claim and hoping that she may know the whereabouts of the missing necklace, Lovett invites Rose and her granddaughter aboard the Kaldish. As Rose examines the recovered material and the wreck footage, she begins recounting her memories of the Titanic, taking the crew back to the events of 1912 and revealing the personal story behind the famous disaster. In 1912, 17-year-old Rose DeWitt Bukater boards the Titanic at Southampton with her mother, Ruth DeWitt Bukater, and her wealthy fiancé Tilda Copyright, Caledon Hackley. Rose belongs to the upper class and is expected to behave according to the strict social conventions of her privileged upbringing. Although she is surrounded by wealth and luxury, Rose is deeply unhappy with her impending marriage to California. Ruth insists that Rose marry him because the family is experiencing serious financial difficulties, and Cal's wealth and social position would preserve their family's status. Rose consequently feels that her future has already been decided for her and that she has little control over her own life. During the voyage, Rose becomes increasingly overwhelmed by the expectations placed upon her. In a moment of despair, she goes to the stern of the Titanic and considers jumping into the ocean. Before she can do so, she is discovered by Jack Dawson, a poor and adventurous young artist traveling in third class. Jack manages to persuade Rose not to jump and helps her return safely to the deck. Their unusual first meeting develops into a friendship, despite the enormous social and economic differences between them. Jack is fascinated by Rose's personality and recognizes that beneath her sophisticated appearance she longs for freedom. Rose, meanwhile, becomes increasingly drawn to Jack's spontaneous outlook and his rejection of the social restrictions that dominate her life. Jack introduces her to a world far removed from the formal dinners, etiquette, and expectations of first-class society. Their friendship gradually develops into a powerful romantic relationship. Rose's growing affection for Jack places her increasingly at odds with both Cal and her mother, who regard Jack as an unsuitable companion because of his poverty and social position. Rose eventually allows Jack to make a portrait of her wearing the heart of the ocean, the necklace given to her by California. The encounter becomes a defining moment in their relationship and symbolizes Rose's willingness to reject the restrictive identity imposed upon her. Jack and Rose subsequently attempt to avoid Cal's valet, Spicer Lovejoy, who has been instructed to watch Rose and report her activities to California. Their relationship continues to deepen as the Titanic approaches the dangerous waters of the North Atlantic. That night, the Titanic receives warnings about icebergs in its path. Despite the ship's reputation for being extraordinarily safe, it continues its journey through the North Atlantic at high speed. Eventually, the lookouts spot an iceberg directly ahead. The ship attempts to avoid the obstacle, but the iceberg strikes the starboard side of the vessel, causing extensive damage below the waterline. Water begins flooding multiple compartments, and the ship's officers gradually realize that the Titanic cannot survive. Jack and Rose witness the collision and begin to understand the seriousness of the situation. Meanwhile, Cal discovers evidence of their relationship and becomes furious. Seeking revenge against Jack, he arranges for the heart of the ocean to be planted among Jack's belongings, causing Jack to be falsely accused of stealing the valuable necklace. Jack is arrested and restrained in the ship's master-at-arms office while the Titanic continues taking on water. Cal retains possession of the necklace, using the situation to manipulate Rose and maintain control over her. As the Titanic's condition deteriorates, Captain Edward Smith and the ship's officers order the passengers toward the lifeboats. Because there are not enough lifeboat spaces for everyone aboard, the evacuation is conducted according to the prevailing maritime procedures of the period, with women and children generally receiving priority. The situation rapidly becomes chaotic as passengers begin to understand that the ship is in genuine danger of sinking. Rose initially boards a lifeboat, but she refuses to abandon Jack. Realizing that she cannot leave him behind, she jumps back onto the Titanic. She finds Jack and helps free him from his confinement, after which they attempt to make their way towards safety through the increasingly flooded corridors and decks. Cal pursues them with a firearm, enraged by Rose's decision to reject him. During the chase, Cal realizes that he still possesses the heart of the ocean because it is inside the code he had given Rose. His pursuit ultimately fails when Jack and Rose escape into another section of the ship. Cal eventually attempts to save himself by joining a lifeboat under false pretenses, claiming that he is responsible for a child so that he can secure a place among those being evacuated. As the sinking progresses, the Titanic's bow plunges deeper beneath the ocean while the stern rises dramatically into the air. Thousands of passengers and crew members struggle to survive as the ship's decks become increasingly steep and unstable. Jack and Rose cling to the ship as it reaches the final stages of its destruction. Eventually, the Titanic breaks apart, sending the remaining passengers and wreckage into the freezing North Atlantic. Jack and Rose find themselves in the icy water surrounded by debris and struggling survivors. Jack helps Rose climb onto a piece of floating wreckage that can support her weight above the water. He remains partially submerged in the freezing ocean beside her. Knowing that Rose must survive, Jack makes her promise that she will continue living and build a future for herself. He encourages her not to surrender to despair and reminds her that she has an entire life ahead of her. Jack eventually dies from hypothermia caused by prolonged exposure to the freezing water. Rose remains on the wreckage until she is discovered by a returning lifeboat searching for survivors. She is rescued and later brought aboard the RMS Carpathia, which arrives to rescue the Titanic survivors. During the journey to New York, Rose decides to separate herself permanently from the identity and expectations that had controlled her life before the disaster. When Rose arrives in New York City, she avoids Cal and her mother and gives her name as Rose Dawson, adopting Jack's surname as a tribute to the man who saved her life. By doing so, she symbolically begins a new existence independent of the wealthy social world into which she had been born. She never returns to the life that had been planned for her and instead chooses to live according to her own wishes. The story eventually returns to 1996, where elderly Rose continues describing the aftermath of the Titanic disaster to Lovett and his team. She explains that Cal later married another woman and ultimately lost his fortune following the 1929 stock market crash. Rose also emphasizes that Jack's importance to her life extended far beyond their brief time together aboard the Titanic. He gave her the courage to escape the restrictive life she had been forced into and inspired her to pursue the freedom and experiences she had once only dreamed about. Rose reveals that she spent the decades after the disaster building an independent life filled with experiences that reflected the ambitions she had developed during her time with Jack. Photographs displayed in her room show her participating in numerous activities and adventures that would have been unimaginable within the rigid social world of her youth. These images demonstrate that Rose kept the promise she made to Jack. She survived, lived fully, and refused to allow the tragedy to define the rest of her existence. Deeply moved by Rose's story, Lovett abandons his obsessive search for the heart of the ocean. Rose later goes alone to the stern of the Caldish, where she reveals that she has secretly kept the necklace throughout her life. Rather than selling the priceless diamond or allowing it to become another object of obsession, she drops it into the ocean above the Titanic wreck. The act represents her final farewell to the past and her decision to return the necklace to the place associated with Jack and the tragedy that transformed her life. Later that night, Rose lies peacefully in her bed. Photographs surrounding her show the extraordinary life she lived after the Titanic, reflecting her independence, courage, and willingness to experience the world. The film then shifts into a dreamlike sequence aboard a restored and pristine Titanic. Rose appears young again and walks toward the grand staircase, where she is reunited with Jack. The passengers and crew members who died in the sinking are gathered around them, applauding as Rose approaches Jack. The sequence functions as a symbolic reunion rather than a literal continuation of events, suggesting that after a long life faithfully honoring Jack's final wish, Rose has finally reached a peaceful place where she can be with him again. Through Rose's memories, the film presents the Titanic disaster not only as a historical catastrophe but also as the defining event of one woman's life. The sinking destroys the world Rose once knew, but it simultaneously gives her the opportunity to reject the social restrictions that had controlled her future. Jack's brief presence encourages her to choose independence, love, courage, and personal fulfillment. The story therefore combines the historical tragedy of the Titanic with a fictional romance centered on survival, sacrifice, memory, and the determination to live fully despite devastating loss. Leonardo Dicaprio portrays Jack Dawson, a fictional 20-year-old itinerant artist and orphan from Chippewa Falls, Wisconsin, who has spent much of his life traveling from place to place and has previously lived in cities including Paris. Jack is poor, independent, adventurous, and highly observant, possessing a natural artistic talent and an outlook that contrasts sharply with the rigid social conventions of Titanic's first-class passengers. Shortly before the ship's departure from Southampton, Jack wins 2 third-class tickets in a poker game and boards the Titanic with his closest friend, Fabrizio De Rossi. After seeing Rose on the ship, Jack becomes immediately interested in her, although their relationship begins when he intervenes to prevent her from jumping from the stern. His friendship with Rose gradually develops into a romance that crosses the rigid class boundaries of the period. After Jack saves Rose, Cal invites him to dine with the first-class passengers as a public gesture of gratitude, allowing Jack to temporarily enter a world of wealth and privilege that is completely foreign to him. Cameron originally considered River Phoenix for the role of Jack, but Phoenix died in 1993 before the film entered production. Although Jack Dawson is entirely fictional, the character's name became associated with a real Titanic victim named Joseph Dawson, whose grave is located at Fairview Cemetery in Halifax, Nova Scotia, where many Titanic victims are buried. The filmmakers were unaware of the real Dawson's existence until after the film had been released. Kate Winslet portrays Rose DeWitt Bukater, a 17-year-old first-class passenger from Philadelphia who is introduced as a young woman trapped by the expectations of her wealthy but financially troubled family. Rose's father has died, leaving the family heavily indebted, and her mother, Ruth DeWitt Bukater, believes that Rose's marriage to the extremely wealthy Caledon Hockley is necessary to preserve their social position and financial security. Although Rose enjoys the privileges associated with first-class society, she increasingly resents the restrictions placed upon her and feels that her engagement has transformed her future into something predetermined and emotionally empty. Her meeting with Jack becomes the turning point of her life, as his freedom, optimism, and rejection of social conventions encourage her to question the world in which she was raised. Rose ultimately chooses love and personal independence over wealth and social expectations, and her survival becomes the foundation of the film's larger theme of living life according to one's own choices. Gloria Stewart portrays Rose Dawson Calvert, the elderly version of Rose who appears in the modern-day framing narrative. Now a centenarian, Rose becomes a key connection between the 1996 treasure-hunting expedition and the events of 1912. After recognizing herself in a recovered drawing from the Titanic wreck, she contacts Brock Lovett and agrees to tell him what she remembers about the ship. Through her extended recollection, Rose becomes the film's narrator and provides the audience with a deeply personal perspective on the disaster. Her older self represents the consequences of the choices she made as a young woman and demonstrates that she ultimately fulfilled Jack's wish that she survive and experience a long, adventurous life. Stewart's interpretation of elderly Rose was partly inspired by American artist Beatrice Wood, whose unconventional personality and long life influenced Cameron's conception of the character. Billy Zane portrays Caledon Cal Hockley, Rose's wealthy, arrogant, and possessive fiancé told the copyright, approximately 30 years old and heir to a powerful Pittsburgh steel fortune. Cal represents the wealth, privilege, and patriarchal expectations of the Edwardian upper class. He expects Rose to obey him and considers their marriage to be a social and financial arrangement rather than a relationship based primarily on mutual affection. Cal becomes increasingly jealous when Rose develops a relationship with Jack, whom he regards as socially inferior and unworthy of Rose's attention. His resentment eventually becomes violent and manipulative, particularly after he discovers Rose's attachment to Jack. Cal's actions during the sinking reveal his willingness to deceive and exploit others in order to survive, while his eventual fate after the disaster reinforces the contrast between his materialistic worldview and Rose's decision to live freely. Frances Fisher portrays Ruth DeWitt Bukater, Rose's widowed mother. Ruth is deeply concerned with maintaining the family's position among the upper classes after her husband's death leaves them facing serious financial difficulties. She therefore pressures Rose to marry Cal, believing that the marriage is necessary to prevent the family from falling out of high society. Ruth is sophisticated, controlling, and deeply conscious of class distinctions. Although she cares for Rose, she places social security and reputation above her daughter's emotional happiness. She strongly disapproves of Jack because he is poor and belongs to the third class, and she regards Rose's growing independence as a threat to the future she has planned for her daughter. Bill Paxton portrays Brock Lovett, the present-day treasure hunter leading the expedition to the Titanic wreck. Lovett is obsessed with locating the heart of the ocean and has invested substantial time and resources into exploring the wreck. Initially, he approaches the Titanic primarily as a historical treasure site and sees Rose as a potentially valuable source of information about the missing necklace. However, listening to Rose's memories changes his understanding of the wreck. By the conclusion, Lovett realizes that the Titanic cannot be reduced to its valuable artifacts or technological remains and that the human stories surrounding the disaster are far more important than the treasure he has been pursuing. Susie Amos portrays Elizabeth Lizzie Calvert, Rose's granddaughter, who accompanies her grandmother aboard the Caldish. Lizzie provides emotional support for Rose while also becoming fascinated by the previously unknown details of her grandmother's youth. Through Rose's story, she learns about Jack Dawson and the circumstances surrounding the Titanic disaster, gaining a new understanding of the extraordinary life her grandmother lived after surviving the sinking. Danny Nucci portrays Fabrizio de Rossi, Jack's Italian best friend and fellow third-class passenger. Fabrizio boards the Titanic with Jack after Jack wins their tickets in a poker game. Energetic, optimistic, and adventurous, Fabrizio shares Jack's excitement about traveling to America and starting a new life. He becomes part of Jack's social circle aboard the ship and participates in the lively third-class celebrations. Fabrizio's fate during the sinking is particularly tragic. He fails to secure a place in a lifeboat and is killed when one of the Titanic's funnels collapses into the water, crushing him and other passengers. David Warner portrays Spicer Lovejoy, Kel's English valet and personal bodyguard, who is depicted as a former Pinkerton detective. Lovejoy is assigned to monitor Rose and investigate the circumstances surrounding Jack's involvement with her. He is suspicious of Jack from the beginning and acts as Cal's enforcer throughout much of the story. Lovejoy helps Cal manipulate the situation surrounding the heart of the ocean and participates in the attempt to frame Jack for theft. During the final stages of the sinking, Lovejoy continues pursuing Jack and Rose but ultimately dies when the Titanic breaks apart. Warner had previously portrayed Titanic survivor and passenger Lawrence Beasley in the 1979 television miniseries SOS Titanic. Jonathan Evans-Jones portrays Wallace Hartley, the Titanic's bandmaster and violinist. Hartley and the ship's musicians are shown performing music on the boat deck as the evacuation continues, attempting to maintain calm among increasingly frightened passengers. During the final stages of the sinking, the band continues playing despite the rapidly deteriorating conditions. The film depicts Hartley leading the musicians in a performance of Nearer, My God, to Thee before the band ultimately ceases playing. Hartley's courage and the musicians' decision to continue performing have become among the most memorable images associated with cinematic depictions of the Titanic disaster. Mark Lindsay Chapman portrays Chief Officer Henry Wilde, one of the Titanic's senior officers. Wilde assists with the evacuation and attempts to maintain order as passengers compete for limited lifeboat spaces. He is shown allowing Cal to board the lifeboat after Cal presents himself as responsible for a child. Later, Wilde attempts to attract the attention of lifeboats and encourage them to return for survivors. After the ship sinks, he dies in the freezing water, and Rose later uses his whistle to attract the attention of 5th Officer Harold Lowell's returning lifeboat. Ewan Stewart portrays First Officer William Murdoch, the senior officer in charge of the bridge when the Titanic encounters the iceberg. The film depicts Murdoch reacting rapidly to the danger and attempting to maneuver the ship away from the iceberg. During the evacuation, he is shown struggling to maintain order and eventually using a firearm amid the chaos. The film's depiction of Murdoch, particularly the suggestion that he shoots passengers and then takes his own life, generated controversy because there is no firm historical evidence establishing that he behaved in this manner. James Cameron later acknowledged the concerns surrounding the portrayal and apologized to Murdoch's family and community, while explaining that the sequence was intended to depict an officer overwhelmed by an unprecedented emergency rather than to portray Murdoch as inherently corrupt or cowardly. Jonathan Phillips portrays Second Officer Charles Lightoller, the senior officer responsible for much of the portside evacuation. Lightoller is depicted emphasizing the women and children first principle and attempting to maintain order among passengers. He carries a firearm during the evacuation to control the increasingly chaotic crowd and is later shown surviving a broad collapsible beam after the Titanic breaks apart. Historically, Lightoller was the most senior officer to survive the disaster and later provided important testimony about the sinking. Kevin Delano portrays Third Officer Herbert Pittman, who assists in the evacuation and is associated with lifeboat number 5. Pittman was among the officers responsible for managing the lifeboats and survived the disaster. His appearance contributes to the film's effort to populate the historical events with recognizable members of the Titanic's crew rather than focusing exclusively on the fictional Jack and Rose. Simon Crane portrays 4th Officer Joseph Boxall, who assists with emergency procedures following the collision. In this film, Boxall is involved in the firing of distress rockets from the ship and later helps manage lifeboat number 2. His character represents the officers who work to communicate the emergency to nearby vessels and coordinate the increasingly difficult evacuation. Ian Graham portrays 5th Officer Harold Lowe, who becomes particularly important during the rescue sequence. Lowe is shown as one of the officers willing to take decisive action after the Titanic sinks. He commands a lifeboat that returns toward the wreck site in search of survivors and eventually discovers Rose in the freezing water. Historically, Lowe was the only Titanic officer known to have taken his lifeboat back to search systematically for survivors in the immediate aftermath of the sinking. Edward Fletcher portrays 6th Officer James Moody, one of the Titanic's junior officers. Moody is shown admitting Jack and Fabrizio onto the ship shortly before departure and later assisting the bridge crew as the vessel approaches the iceberg. He receives information concerning the iceberg and follows orders during the emergency. Moody was the only junior officer to die in the disaster, and the film shows him among the crew members struggling to manage the evacuation. James Lancaster portrays Father Thomas Biles, a Catholic priest traveling as a second-class passenger. Biles is depicted praying with passengers and providing spiritual comfort during the final stages of the disaster. His character represents the religious figures who remained with frightened passengers as the Titanic's situation became increasingly hopeless. Lou Poulter and Elsa Raven portray Isidore and Ida Strauss, the elderly married couple associated with the Macy's department store empire. During the evacuation, Isidore refuses to take a lifeboat while women and children are still waiting to escape, and Ida chooses to remain with him rather than leave him behind. The film portrays the couple lying together in their first-class stateroom as the water rises around them, creating one of its most emotionally powerful images. The real circumstances surrounding their final moments are somewhat different from the film's staging, but historical accounts confirm that Ida refused to abandon her husband. Martin Jarvis portrays Sir Cosmo Duff Gordon, a Scottish baronet who escapes aboard lifeboat number 1 with his wife and her secretary. The historical Duff Gordon became controversial because of allegations that he had encouraged the lifeboat crew not to return for survivors and had offered money to the crew. Duff Gordon denied that the payment was a bribe, and the subsequent British inquiry did not conclude that he had bribed the crew. The inquiry nevertheless criticized the boat's failure to return toward the survivors. The film incorporates the controversy into its depiction of Duff Gordon and the class tensions surrounding the evacuation. Rosalind Ayres portrays Lucy, Lady Duff Gordon, a prominent fashion designer and the wife of Sir Cosmo. She escapes aboard lifeboat number 1 with her husband and secretary. Her presence contributes to the film's broader portrayal of wealthy first-class passengers and the differing ways individuals responded to the evacuation. Like her husband, she became associated historically with controversy concerning the behavior of her lifeboat after the sinking. Rochelle Rose portrays Noelle Leslie, Countess of Rothes, a first-class passenger who is depicted as more compassionate and socially open than some members of the upper-class community. Unlike the more rigid Ruth and other aristocratic figures, she assists with rowing after reaching a lifeboat and demonstrates concern for passengers from less privileged backgrounds. Scott G. Anderson portrays Frederick Fleet, one of the Titanic's lookouts. Fleet is shown stationed in the crow's nest when he spots the iceberg ahead and immediately sounds the warning. His warning initiates the frantic attempt to maneuver the ship away from the obstacle. Fleet survives the sinking aboard lifeboat number 6 and later becomes one of the important witnesses to the disaster. Paul Brightwell portrays Quartermaster Robert Hickens, the sailor at the ship's wheel when the iceberg is sighted. Hickens later takes charge of lifeboat number 6. In this film, he becomes increasingly pessimistic about the possibility of returning toward the wreck to rescue people in the water, contributing to one of the lifeboat's most tense sequences. Martin East portrays Reginald Lee, the second lookout stationed in the crow's nest alongside Frederick Fleet. Lee participates in the search for ice and survives the disaster. His character is part of the film's reconstruction of the Titanic's bridge and lookout operations during the critical minutes before the collision. Gregory Cook portrays Jack Phillips, the Titanic's senior wireless operator. After the seriousness of the collision becomes apparent, Captain Smith orders Phillips to transmit distress signals to nearby ships. Phillips and the junior wireless operator work under extreme pressure to communicate the Titanic's emergency and summon assistance. Craig Kelly portrays Harold Bride, the Titanic's junior wireless operator who works alongside Jack Phillips. Bride assists in transmitting the distress messages as the ship begins to sink and becomes part of the film's depiction of the desperate communications effort undertaken during the disaster. Liam Tweed portrays Chief Baker Charles Joffin, one of the Titanic's crew members who appears during several stages of the sinking. The film shows Joffin helping passengers, following Jack and Rose toward the stern, and eventually holding onto the ship as it disappears beneath the water. He is also seen drinking from a flask. Joffin's survival became one of the more remarkable stories associated with the disaster, as his own testimony described surviving the final plunge into the freezing water. Terry Forrestal portrays Chief Engineer Joseph G. Bell, who represents the engineering crew working below decks to maintain the Titanic's electrical power and essential machinery during the disaster. The film depicts Bell and the engineers continuing their work as the ship floods, helping keep the lights and electrical systems operating long enough for distress communications and evacuation efforts to continue. The exact fate and final locations of the engineering personnel remain less certain than the film suggests, and historical testimony indicates that at least some engineers reached the upper decks during the final stages of the sinking. Derek Lee portrays Frederick Barrett, the leading stoker aboard Titanic. Barrett was responsible for managing the ship's firemen and stokers and later became associated with the operation of Lifeboat No. 13. His role reflects the enormous contribution made by the engineering and boiler room crews, many of whom worked under extremely dangerous conditions to keep the ship's machinery and electrical systems operating during the evacuation. Collectively, the cast of Titanic combines fictional central characters with real passengers, officers, crew members, and historical figures. Jack Dawson, Rose the Wit-Bucator, Cal Hackley, Ruth the Wit-Bucator, Brock Lovett, Fabrizio de Rossi, Spicer Lovejoy, and several other characters are fictional creations designed to provide the film with a dramatic narrative through which audiences can experience the disaster. At the same time, figures such as Captain Edward Smith, Thomas Andrews, J. Bruce Ismay, Margaret Brown, John Jacob Astor IV, Isidore and Ida Strauss, Wallace Hartley, Henry Wilde, William Murdoch, Charles Lightoller, Harold Lowe, and numerous members of the crew are based on real people who were aboard the Titanic. Cameron deliberately combines these two groups so that the fictional romance of Jack and Rose unfolds within a carefully constructed recreation of the historical disaster. The result is an ensemble in which personal drama, social conflict, historical detail, and large-scale disaster storytelling operate together, allowing the film to portray the Titanic not merely as a shipwreck but as a human tragedy experienced differently by passengers and crew members across every level of society. After completing the initial underwater photography of the Titanic wreck, James Cameron turned his attention to developing the screenplay and constructing the historical and emotional framework of the film. His approach was shaped by a determination to treat the Titanic disaster with respect, particularly because more than 1,500 people lost their lives in the sinking. Cameron spent approximately 6 months researching the ship, its passengers, its crew, the circumstances of the maiden voyage, and the sequence of events that led to the disaster. Rather than treating the historical material as a loose backdrop for a fictional story, he attempted to reconstruct the voyage and sinking with considerable chronological and technical precision. He developed a detailed timeline covering the Titanic's departure from Southampton, its progress across the Atlantic, the iceberg warnings, the collision, the evacuation, the breakup of the ship, and the eventual rescue of survivors. The timeline and historical details were checked against available research and consultation with experts so that the fictional narrative could be placed as convincingly as possible within the real events of April 1912. Cameron's ambition was to create what he regarded as a definitive cinematic visualization of the disaster, essentially imagining what it might have been like to witness the Titanic's final hours firsthand. He wanted audiences to feel as though they had been transported back in time and were experiencing the events alongside the passengers and crew rather than simply watching a conventional historical reenactment. Cameron's understanding of the Titanic was also strongly influenced by A Night to Remember, the acclaimed 1958 British film about the disaster, which he had watched during his youth. The earlier film had a significant impact on Cameron's conception of how the sinking could be portrayed with seriousness, historical detail, and emotional restraint. While developing Titanic, Cameron drew inspiration from several sequences in A Night to Remember, including the depiction of the lively third-class passenger gatherings and the musicians continuing to perform as the ship sank. Some elements of dialogue, staging, and dramatic situations were deliberately adapted or closely echoed as a tribute to the earlier film. Cameron's intention was not simply to reproduce the previous movie but to build upon its historical approach using the technological capabilities available in the 1990s, including large-scale practical sets, miniature work, computer-generated imagery, underwater photography, and advanced visual effects. His film therefore combined the influence of earlier Titanic cinema with an unprecedented emphasis on visual realism and large-scale spectacle. At the heart of Cameron's screenplay was his belief that the Titanic disaster had gradually become detached from the individual human experiences that made it so tragic. He viewed the sinking almost like an enormous historical novel that had actually happened, containing thousands of individual stories involving love, fear, courage, social inequality, sacrifice, confusion, and loss. In his view, however, popular discussions of the Titanic had often reduced the event to a simplified morality tale about human arrogance and the supposedly unsinkable ship. Cameron wanted his film to restore the human dimension by allowing audiences to experience the disaster from the perspective of individual characters, rather than presenting the sinking only as a sequence of technical failures and historical facts. He designed the story so that viewers would become emotionally attached to people whose lives were transformed by the catastrophe. This approach led Cameron to create the fictional romance between Jack Dawson and Rose the Wit-Bucator as the emotional center of the film. Jack and Rose were not historical passengers, but the relationship allowed Cameron to place the audience inside the larger disaster through two characters from radically different social backgrounds. Rose represents the wealthy first-class world and the restrictive expectations imposed upon women of her social position, while Jack represents freedom, spontaneity, artistic expression, and the less privileged passengers traveling in third class. The relationship also gives the film a way to explore the rigid class divisions aboard the Titanic. Cameron believed that the romance would provide audiences with a deeply personal emotional connection to the disaster and that the eventual destruction of the relationship would make the historical tragedy more devastating. In his conception, the audience would not simply mourn the thousands of people who died as an abstract historical statistic, they would also mourn the loss of Jack and the life Rose might have shared with him. Cameron described Titanic as fundamentally a love story surrounded by meticulously researched historical events, rather than simply a disaster movie. The enormous sinking sequence, in this conception, was designed to serve the emotional story rather than replace it. The disaster becomes progressively more powerful because audiences first become invested in Jack and Rose and then experience the destruction of their world alongside them. Cameron believed that the emotional impact of the Titanic sinking would be significantly greater if viewers understood what the characters stood to lose. Jack and Rose's relationship therefore provides the narrative foundation upon which the later disaster sequences are built. Their romance gives meaning to the evacuation, the separation of passengers, that destruction of the ship, and Rose's eventual survival, transforming the historical catastrophe into a deeply personal story of love, sacrifice, and loss. The screenplay also introduced the modern-day character of Brock Lovett, whose treasure-hunting expedition provides the narrative framework connecting the present to 1912. Lovett initially approaches the Titanic primarily as a wreck containing valuable artifacts, particularly the legendary Heart of the Ocean diamond. Cameron deliberately used this character to represent a modern perspective that is fascinated by the material remains of the Titanic but disconnected from the human tragedy that occurred aboard the ship. Lovett's obsession with recovering the necklace reflects the tendency to treat the wreck as a historical treasure chest rather than a final resting place containing the remains and memories of thousands of people. His perspective changes when he encounters the elderly Rose Dawson Calvert and hears her personal account of the disaster. By the end of the story, Lovett has gained a much deeper understanding of what the Titanic represents, and his abandonment of the treasure hunt reflects the film's larger argument that the human stories surrounding the disaster are more important than its material artifacts. Cameron further strengthened this connection between past and present through the creation of elderly Rose, who serves as both the survivor and the film's principal narrator. Rather than telling the entire story solely through a conventional historical flashback, Cameron constructed the narrative around an elderly woman remembering events that occurred more than 8 decades earlier. This structure allows the audience to see both the Titanic as a historical event and the enormous effect that the disaster had on Rose's entire life. The modern Rose acts as a bridge between two different eras, allowing the past to be remembered from the perspective of someone who actually experienced it. Her existence also makes the passage of time emotionally tangible. Audiences first meet her as an elderly survivor and then gradually discover the young woman she once was, making the contrast between her two identities an important part of the film's emotional architecture. The framing device involving elderly Rose was also intended to emphasize the idea that history survives through personal memory, instead of allowing the Titanic to remain a distant event that happened in 1912. Cameron uses Rose's recollections to transform it into something immediate and intimate. Her memories reveal that the disaster was not simply the sinking of a famous ship but an experience that permanently shaped the lives of the survivors. The years between the sinking and Rose's return to the story in 1996 therefore become an important emotional element. Her photographs, memories, and reflections suggest that the choices she made after surviving the Titanic were deeply influenced by Jack and by the promise she made to him in the freezing Atlantic. The elderly Rose effectively demonstrates that the consequences of the disaster continued long after the ship disappeared beneath the ocean. The ending was deliberately constructed to remain somewhat open to personal interpretation. Kate Winslet and Gloria Stewart reportedly interpreted the final sequence as suggesting that Rose had died peacefully and that the reunion with Jack aboard the Titanic represented an afterlife or dreamlike spiritual experience. Cameron, however, resisted providing a definitive explanation. Rather than explicitly confirming whether Rose is dreaming, remembering, dying, or experiencing a symbolic reunion, he preferred to leave the meaning of the final sequence to individual viewers. His position was that the ending should communicate emotional closure without forcing the audience into a single literal interpretation. The pristine Titanic, the gathering of the passengers who died in the sinking, and Rose's reunion with Jack therefore function as a deliberately symbolic conclusion to a story centered on memory, survival, love, and the passage of time. Ultimately, Cameron's screenplay was designed to operate simultaneously on several levels. On the surface, Titanic is an epic historical romance centered on Jack and Rose. Beneath that romance, it is a detailed reconstruction of one of the most famous maritime disasters in history. At the same time, it explores social class, wealth, gender expectations, personal freedom, sacrifice, survival, memory, and the relationships between historical events and the individuals who experience them. Cameron's extensive research provided the historical framework, while the fictional characters gave audiences an emotional entry point into the catastrophe. By combining the large-scale spectacle of the Titanic's destruction with the intimate story of two people whose lives briefly intersected aboard the doomed ship, Cameron sought to transform a familiar historical event into an immersive human experience, one in which the audience could not only understand how the Titanic sank, but also feel what its loss meant to the people who were there. The casting of Titanic was a lengthy and highly selective process because James Cameron wanted the actors to do more than simply portray fictional characters. He wanted them to create the impression that they genuinely belonged aboard the Titanic and could convincingly recreate the energy, excitement, social atmosphere, and emotional intensity of the ship's maiden voyage. Cameron believed the cast needed to feel as though they were experiencing the world of the Titanic rather than performing on a film set, particularly because the movie required the actors to move naturally between intimate romantic scenes, elaborate first-class social gatherings, and the increasingly chaotic and terrifying circumstances of the sinking. For the role of Jack Dawson, Cameron specifically wanted a young performer capable of projecting optimism, spontaneity, charm, vulnerability, and an adventurous spirit. Several established actors were considered during the early stages of casting, including Chris O'Donnell and Stephen Dorff, but Cameron felt they appeared too mature for the approximately 20-year-old character he had envisioned. Tom Cruise also expressed interest in the project, but his asking price was considered too high for the role. Jared Leto was another possibility, although he declined to audition. Billy Crudup was placed on the short list and was invited to audition, but he ultimately turned down the opportunity because he was not interested in the part and instead chose to star in Without Limits, 1998. Crudup later acknowledged that Titanic might not have achieved the same result with him in the role. Other performers who auditioned or were considered included Jeremy Sisto, who filmed several screen tests opposite Kate Winslet and other actresses competing for roles. Matthew McConaughey, Ethan Hawke, Christian Bale, and Paul Rudd. Mark Wahlberg also met with Cameron to discuss the possibility of playing Jack, although Cameron ultimately did not pursue him. McConaughey was reportedly considered seriously but was rejected after he was unwilling to alter his southern accent for the part. Cameron had originally envisioned Jack as a charismatic, open-hearted young man in the tradition of classic Hollywood performers such as James Stewart and Gregory Peck rather than as a dark, brooding, psychologically troubled character. Leonardo Dicaprio ultimately emerged as Cameron's choice for Jack Dawson after casting director Mali Finn brought the young actor to the director's attention. At the time, DiCaprio was only 21 and had already established himself as a rising young actor, but he initially showed little enthusiasm for the role. During his first meeting with Cameron, he was reluctant to perform the romantic reading requested of him and initially refused to read the scene seriously. Cameron recalled that DiCaprio eventually demonstrated a brief but unmistakable spark that convinced him there was something special in the actor's screen presence. Cameron wanted Jack to possess an effortless charm and emotional openness rather than the stereotypical characteristics that DiCaprio initially seemed inclined to bring to the part. The director therefore assured him that he would not turn Jack into an excessively brooding or neurotic character or burden him with artificial mannerisms. Instead, Cameron envisioned Jack as a natural, optimistic, adventurous young artist whose enthusiasm for life would contrast with Rose's increasingly restricted existence. Once DiCaprio committed himself to the role, his chemistry with Kate Winslet became one of the decisive factors in the casting process. After Winslet screen tested with DiCaprio, she was reportedly so impressed that she immediately encouraged Cameron to cast him even if he ultimately decided against choosing her. DiCaprio eventually accepted the role and chose Titanic over other opportunities, including the lead in Paul Thomas Anderson's Boogie Nights, 1997. Years later, in 2025, DiCaprio said that he regretted turning down Boogie Nights, describing it as an important film of his generation. Although his decision to star in Titanic ultimately became one of the defining choices of his career, the casting of Rose DeWitt Bukater was equally important because Cameron wanted the character to appear simultaneously elegant, vulnerable, intelligent, rebellious, and emotionally alive. He described Rose as having an Audrey Hepburn type of quality, envisioning her as a young woman whose outward refinement concealed a strong desire to escape the rigid expectations imposed upon her by her family and social position. Mali Finn also brought Kate Winslet to Cameron's attention, although Winslet was initially only one of several actresses being considered. Gwyneth Paltrow, Winona Ryder, Claire Danes, Gabrielle Anwar, and Reese Witherspoon were among the actresses considered for the part. Paltrow eventually chose to appear in Great Expectations, 1998, while Danes felt that Titanic was not the right project for her. Winslet, however, became exceptionally determined to secure the role. While still in England, she repeatedly contacted Cameron and sent him messages emphasizing why she believed she was right for Rose. Her persistence eventually led Cameron to invite her to Hollywood for further auditions. Even after an impressive screen test, Cameron remained uncertain about the final decision, prompting Winslet to continue campaigning for the part. At one point, she sent Cameron a single rose accompanied by a card signed from your Rose and later contacted him by telephone to insist that she was the right actress for the character. Her determination, combined with her acting ability and screen presence, eventually convinced Cameron he believed Winslet possessed the particular quality he was searching for in Rose, especially in her face and eyes, which he felt would enable audiences to emotionally connect with her character and follow her through the extraordinary transformation she experiences during the story. Winslet herself understood Rose as a young woman with tremendous emotional potential who possesses an open heart and a powerful desire to explore the world, yet feels trapped by the expectations and circumstances surrounding her. The casting of elderly Rose was handled differently because Cameron wanted the older version of the character to feel unmistakably connected to Winslet's younger Rose. He instructed Mally Finn to search for actresses associated with Hollywood's golden age of the 1930s and 1940s who could convincingly embody the spirit of a woman who had lived a long, independent, adventurous life. Among those considered was Fay Wray, but Cameron ultimately selected Gloria Stewart, who was 87 years old at the time. Cameron was initially unfamiliar with Stewart's career, but he was deeply impressed by her personality, clarity, enthusiasm, and vitality. During their meeting, he recognized what he described as a shared spirit between Stewart and Winslet, particularly a sense of joie de vivre that could allow audiences to accept the elderly Rose and the young Rose as two versions of the same person. Because Stewart was already elderly, additional makeup was used to age her appearance further so that she could portray Rose as a centenarian reflecting on events that had occurred more than 8 decades earlier. Stewart's performance became essential to the film's framing structure because elderly Rose is not merely a narrator but the emotional bridge between the historical events of 1912 and the modern-day search for the Titanic's lost treasures. For the role of Caledon Calhackley, Rose's wealthy, controlling, and increasingly antagonistic fiancé Dicaprio, Cameron considered Michael Biehn, with whom he had previously collaborated on The Terminator, Aliens, and The Abyss. Matthew McConaughey was also considered for the role, while Rob Lowe later said that he had pursued it as well. The character ultimately went to Billy Zane, whose performance emphasized Cal's combination of aristocratic confidence, possessiveness, arrogance, insecurity, and social entitlement. Cal was written as a man who regards Rose as both his future wife and an extension of his family's social standing, making his hostility toward Jack an important part of the film's class conflict. Zane's portrayal therefore needed to make Cal intimidating without turning him into a completely one-dimensional villain. His jealousy and desperation increasingly emerge as Rose becomes more independent and emotionally committed to Jack. The supporting cast was assembled with the same attention to historical atmosphere and character contrast. Frances Fisher was cast as Ruth DeWitt Bukater, Rose's widowed mother, whose primary concern is preserving the family's upper-class position despite their financial difficulties. Kathy Bates was selected to portray Margaret Malley Brown, the outspoken and socially unconventional first-class passenger who befriends Jack and helps him navigate the unfamiliar world of the upper decks. Reba McEntire had originally been considered for the role of Malley Brown but ultimately turned it down because of conflicts with her touring schedule, allowing Bates to take on the character. Bates brought warmth, humor, confidence, and determination to Molly, making her an important counterpoint to the more rigid members of the first-class social circle. Victor Garber was cast as Thomas Andrews, the Titanic's builder, while Bernard Hill portrayed Captain Edward John Smith. Jonathan Hyde played J. Bruce Ismay, the managing director of the White Star Line, and David Warner portrayed Spicer Lovejoy, Cal's intimidating valet and bodyguard. Danny Nucci was cast as Fabrizio de Rossi, Jack's Italian friend and traveling companion, while Jason Barry portrayed Tommy Ryan, an Irish third-class passenger who becomes part of Jack and Fabrizio's circle. Susie Amos was cast as Lizzie Calvert, Rose's granddaughter in the modern-day storyline, providing another link between Rose's past and present. Bill Paxton completed the modern-day framing narrative as Brock Lovett, the treasure hunter whose initial obsession with recovering the heart of the ocean ultimately gives way to a deeper understanding of the human tragedy associated with the wreck. The remainder of the ensemble was deliberately populated with actors capable of portraying recognizable historical figures as well as fictional passengers and crew members. Lou Poulter and Elsa Raven portrayed Isidore and Ida Strauss, while Lyric Braeden played John Jacob Astor IV and Charlotte Chatton portrayed his young wife, Madeline. Bernard Fox appeared as Colonel Archibald Gracie IV, while Michael Ensign played Benjamin Guggenheim. Jonathan Evans-Jones portrayed Wallace Hartley, the ship's bandmaster whose musicians continued performing during the final stages of the sinking. Mark Lindsay Chapman played Chief Officer Henry Wilde, Ewan Stewart portrayed First Officer William Murdoch, and Jonathan Phillips played Second Officer Charles Lightoller. Ian Graham appeared as Fifth Officer Harold Lowe, who was shown returning toward the wreck site to search for survivors, while Edward Fletcher played Sixth Officer James Moody. Other performers portrayed officers, crew members, wireless operators, lookouts, passengers, and members of the Titanic's engineering staff, creating a large ensemble intended to make the ship feel populated by hundreds of distinct individuals rather than functioning merely as a backdrop for Jack and Rose. Cameron's casting strategy ultimately became one of the defining strengths of Titanic. The final ensemble combined major young stars, established performers, veteran actors, and actors portraying real historical figures, allowing the film to move convincingly between its fictional romance and its recreation of the 1912 disaster. Dicaprio and Winslet provided the emotional center, while Stewart gave the story its reflective modern perspective and the supporting cast supplied the historical and social environment surrounding them. Cameron's emphasis on finding actors who could communicate the energy, optimism, class divisions, elegance, and humanity of the Titanic's passengers helped make the enormous production feel personal. The final casting also contributed significantly to the film's lasting impact, particularly through the widely recognized performances of Dicaprio, Winslet, Stewart, Bates, Zane, Fisher, Hill, Garber, and the many actors portraying the ship's real passengers and crew. The release of Titanic was the result of carefully coordinated distribution arrangement between Paramount Pictures and 20th Century Fox, with Paramount handling the film's domestic theatrical distribution in the United States and Canada, while 20th Century Fox was responsible for distributing the film in international markets. The two studios initially planned for James Cameron's ambitious production to reach theaters on July 2, 1997, a strategically important date because it would place the film in the lucrative summer blockbuster season, when major Hollywood releases traditionally benefited from increased theater attendance and holiday period audiences. However, as production progressed, it became increasingly clear that the enormous scale of the project and the complexity of its visual effects made the original release schedule unrealistic. By April 1997, Cameron acknowledged that the film's extensive effects work could not be completed in time for the July release date. The studios subsequently considered moving the film to late July or early August, but this created additional scheduling complications because Paramount already had several major summer releases planned. Reports also indicated that Harrison Ford, whose films had been commercially important to Paramount through franchises such as Indiana Jones and Jack Ryan, objected to the possibility of Titanic opening too close to his upcoming film Air Force One, which was scheduled for July 25, 1997. The combination of Cameron's production delays, the unfinished visual effects, and the studio's crowded summer release calendar eventually made a summer debut increasingly impractical. On May 29, 1997, Paramount officially announced that Titanic would be postponed from its planned summer release to December 19, 1997. The decision immediately generated considerable skepticism within the entertainment industry because the film had already become one of the most expensive productions ever undertaken and had experienced highly publicized delays. Its new December release date also placed it alongside other major holiday season releases, including the James Bond film Tomorrow Never Dies and Most Hunt. The postponement fueled speculation that the production was experiencing serious difficulties or that the finished film might not meet the expectations created by its enormous budget. At the same time, the studios were attempting to protect their summer box office slate by concentrating on other major releases scheduled for the season, including Hercules, Face Off, The Lost World, Jurassic Park, My Best Friend's Wedding, Speed 2, Cruise Control, Con Air, Batman Robin, Men in Black, Air Force One, and Conspiracy Theory. Paramount also moved the opening of Event Horizon forward to August in an effort to fill part of the summer schedule created by Titanic's departure. Despite the negative speculation surrounding the delay, the film began generating increasingly favorable reactions before its official release. A preview screening held in Minneapolis on July 14, 1997 received a strongly positive response from its audience. Word of mouth from the preview gradually spread, including through emerging online communities, helping to counter the earlier perception that the production's enormous budget and prolonged schedule indicated a troubled film. Positive reactions from early viewers and increasingly favorable industry commentary began to change the public narrative surrounding the project. Instead of being viewed solely as an excessively expensive production that had missed its summer release date, Titanic increasingly became one of the year's most anticipated films. James Cameron also made an unusual decision concerning the film's world premiere. He did not want the premiere to take place in Los Angeles, despite the importance that Hollywood traditionally placed on major premieres being held there. Paramount initially disagreed with Cameron's preference, but 20th Century Fox ultimately supported the decision. As a result, Titanic received its world premiere on November 1, 1997, at the Tokyo International Film Festival in Japan. The initial Japanese reaction was reportedly relatively restrained, with the New York Times characterizing the response as tepid. Nevertheless, the Tokyo premiere gave international audiences and members of the press their first substantial opportunity to see the completed film and marked the beginning of its formal promotional rollout. Following the Tokyo premiere, increasingly positive reviews began appearing in the United States, building anticipation for the film's domestic opening. The major Hollywood premiere eventually took place on December 14, 1997, 5 days before the film's general U.S. theatrical release. The event attracted numerous prominent Hollywood stars and generated enthusiastic reactions from attendees, many of whom praised the film to the international media. The premiere helped transform Titanic from a heavily scrutinized and delayed production into one of the most talked-about cinematic events of the year. The film also received a prestigious London premiere as a royal film performance, attended by Prince Charles, further emphasizing the movie's international profile and its connection to the historical British disaster. Titanic subsequently opened theatrically in the United States on December 19, 1997, distributed domestically by Paramount Pictures and internationally by 20th Century Fox. The decision to move the film from the summer to the holiday season ultimately proved extraordinarily successful. Rather than suffering from the delayed release, Titanic benefited from the extended Christmas and New Year holiday period, strong audience word of mouth, repeat viewings, and increasingly enthusiastic critical and public reception. Its release quickly developed into a major cultural event, with the film remaining in theaters for an exceptionally long period and continuing to attract audiences well beyond the traditional theatrical window. The combination of its December release, emotional appeal, spectacular production design, large-scale visual effects, historical setting, romantic storyline, and strong performances by Leonardo DiCaprio and Kate Winslet allowed Titanic to develop from a heavily questioned production into a phenomenon that dominated the global box office. The film's release history therefore became an important part of its larger legacy, A project once viewed by some observers as dangerously delayed and excessively expensive ultimately became one of the most successful theatrical releases in film history. Titanic became one of the most extraordinary box office phenomena in the history of cinema, achieving an unprecedented level of commercial success that extended far beyond its original 1997–1998 theatrical run, including revenue generated by its subsequent 2012, 2017, and 2023 theatrical re-releases. The film has earned approximately $674.3 million in North America and $1.590 billion in international markets, bringing its cumulative worldwide theatrical gross to approximately $2.264 billion. Its original release alone established Titanic as the highest-grossing film of 1997 and rapidly transformed it into a global cultural phenomenon. In 1998, it surpassed Jurassic Park, 1993, to become the highest-grossing film ever made worldwide, a position it maintained for more than a decade. The record was eventually surpassed by James Cameron's Avatar, 2009, which overtook Titanic in 2010 following its own successful theatrical run and re-release. Despite losing the all-time worldwide record, Titanic remained one of the most commercially successful films in history and continued to generate substantial revenue through later theatrical revivals, home entertainment, television rights, soundtrack sales, and other ancillary markets. A major milestone in the film's original theatrical performance came on March 1, 1998, when Titanic became the first motion picture in history to surpass $1 billion in worldwide box office revenue. Its extraordinary staying power was particularly remarkable because, unlike many modern blockbusters that achieve the majority of their earnings during their opening weekends, Titanic maintained exceptionally strong attendance for months after release. The film repeatedly returned to the top of international box office charts and benefited from powerful word-of-mouth, repeat viewings, and its appeal to audiences across different age groups and countries. Its commercial performance was further strengthened by its combination of romance, historical drama, disaster spectacle, lavish production design, visual effects, and the star power of Leonardo Dicaprio and Kate Winslet. The film's enormous popularity also helped turn its central love story and soundtrack, particularly Celine Dion's My Heart Will Go On, into major international cultural phenomena. The film achieved another historic milestone during its 2012 3D re-release, which was timed to coincide with the centenary of the real Titanic disaster. During the weekend of April 13–15, 2012, exactly 100 years after the original ship's sinking, the newly converted 3D version generated enough additional revenue to push the film's cumulative worldwide gross beyond $2 billion. This made Titanic only the second film in history to cross the $2 billion worldwide threshold, following Avatar. The 2012 re-release demonstrated that the film retains substantial audience appeal even 15 years after its original theatrical debut, while the enhanced 3D presentation allowed a new generation of moviegoers to experience Cameron's large-scale production on the big screen. Further anniversary screenings and re-releases, including the 2017-20th anniversary presentation and the 2023-25th anniversary re-release, added substantially to its lifetime theatrical earnings and helped maintain its position among the world's highest-grossing films. In North America, Titanic became a particularly significant commercial achievement for Paramount Pictures. For many years, it was the studio's highest-grossing domestic release before its record was eventually surpassed by Top Gun: Maverick, 2022. 25 years after Titanic first established the benchmark, its domestic performance has also remained remarkable when adjusted for inflation. Box Office Mojo estimates that Titanic ranks among the highest-grossing films of all time in the United States and Canada when ticket price inflation is taken into account, reflecting the enormous number of people who paid to see it during its original theatrical engagement. Estimates indicate that the film sold more than 128 million tickets in the United States during its initial theatrical run alone, an extraordinary figure that illustrates the scale of its popularity at the time. Its success was not limited to North America, however, as the film became a major international blockbuster in virtually every major film market. Titanic was also exceptionally successful in markets where Hollywood films traditionally faced stronger competition from local cinema. India became one of its most notable international success stories, with the film becoming the first foreign-language film to achieve such a major level of commercial success in the country. Its popularity was attributed in part to the film's romantic storytelling, melodramatic emotional structure, musical elements, family and social themes, and class-based conflict, all of which resonated strongly with Indian audiences and shared characteristics with elements commonly found in Bollywood cinema. The film's success in India further demonstrated the extent to which Titanic had transcended cultural and linguistic boundaries. The film's unprecedented success also contributed to an exceptionally strong period for the North American film industry. The enormous box office performance of Titanic, combined with a large group of commercially successful releases during 1998, including Armageddon, Saving Private Ryan, The Lost World, Jurassic Park, Men in Black, There's Something About Mary, A Bug's Life, Deep Impact, Rush Hour, Dr. Dolittle, The Waterboy, Godzilla, and Lethal Weapon 4 helped drive the North American theatrical market to a record-setting year. Titanic was therefore not merely a successful individual film, its unprecedented attendance and sustained theatrical run became one of the defining commercial events of the late 1990s film industry. Over the years, Titanic has continued to benefit from its unusual longevity. Rather than disappearing from public attention after its initial theatrical release, the film repeatedly returned to cinemas for major anniversaries and technological upgrades, allowing it to accumulate additional box office revenue decades after its original debut. Its 3D conversion, anniversary screenings, remastered presentations, and later theatrical reissues introduced the film to audiences who were either too young to experience it in 1997 or had never seen it on a large screen. By combining the revenue from its original theatrical release with these later reissues, Titanic reached a cumulative worldwide theatrical gross of approximately $2.264 billion, firmly establishing it as one of the most commercially enduring films ever produced. The film's box office achievements are particularly notable because they were accomplished despite its enormous production cost. With an estimated production budget of around $200 million, Titanic was the most expensive film ever made at the time of its production, and its escalating budget and repeated delays initially generated considerable concern within the industry. Some observers even predicted that the film's financial risks could seriously damage the studios involved. Instead, Titanic became a historic financial success, recovering its production costs many times over and generating billions of dollars in theatrical and ancillary revenue. Its performance ultimately transformed what had initially been regarded as one of Hollywood's greatest production gambles into one of the industry's most successful investments. Today, Titanic remains a landmark in worldwide box office history. Although its position as the all-time highest-grossing film has changed as newer releases and re-releases have appeared, its $2.264 billion cumulative worldwide theatrical gross, extraordinary inflation-adjusted performance, record-breaking original run, status as the first $1 billion film, and distinction as the second film to surpass $2 billion continue to make it one of the defining commercial achievements of modern cinema. More importantly, its repeated ability to attract audiences more than 2 decades after its original release demonstrates that its box office legacy is closely connected to its enduring cultural impact. The film's combination of historical spectacle, romantic drama, technical innovation, emotional storytelling, and cinematic scale allowed it to remain commercially relevant across multiple generations and established Titanic as one of the rare films whose theatrical life has continued long after its original release. Titanic received overwhelmingly positive critical and audience attention upon its release and has subsequently developed into one of the most extensively discussed and influential films of the late 20th century. Critics praised James Cameron's direction, the film's extraordinary production design and visual effects, its recreation of the 1912 disaster, the performances of Leonardo DiCaprio, Kate Winslet, and Gloria Stewart, James Horner's musical score, Russell Carpenter's cinematography, the scale and ambition of the production, and its ability to combine a fictional romantic story with a meticulously reconstructed historical catastrophe. Although the film also attracted significant criticism for its melodramatic dialogue, conventional romance, broad characterization, and occasional historical liberties, its technical achievements, emotional effectiveness, and ability to turn a well-known historical tragedy into an immersive cinematic experience were widely recognized. Audiences responded even more enthusiastically than many critics, with Titanic receiving a rare A+ cinema score, placing it among the relatively small number of films to receive the highest possible grade in cinema scores polling history. Its enormous popularity also stimulated extensive academic discussion concerning historical memory, class, gender, romance, disaster cinema, technology, celebrity culture, and the representation of the Titanic disaster in popular culture. On Rotten Tomatoes, Titanic currently holds an 88% approval rating based on 255 critics' reviews, with an average rating of 8.1. The site's consensus characterizes the film as a major achievement for Cameron, emphasizing its combination of spectacular visuals and traditional Hollywood melodrama. On Metacritic, the film has a weighted score of 75 out of 100 based on 35 critics, indicating generally favorable reviews. These aggregate scores demonstrate that, while the film was not universally acclaimed and generated a substantial critical backlash in some quarters, the overall contemporary critical response was strongly positive. Its audience response was even more emphatic. Cinema Score audiences awarded the film an exceptional A+, reflecting the extraordinary degree to which general moviegoers connected with its characters, romance, spectacle, and emotional climax. The contrast between some of the film's harsher contemporary reviews and its exceptionally strong audience reception became one of the defining aspects of the critical conversation surrounding Titanic. Among the film's strongest supporters was Roger Ebert, who praised its overall craftsmanship, construction, performances, technical achievement, and ability to maintain an emotional connection despite the enormous logistical challenges involved in recreating one of history's most famous maritime disasters. Ebert regarded the combination of technical spectacle, historical reconstruction, and dramatic storytelling as extraordinarily difficult to accomplish and argued that Cameron succeeded in maintaining a convincing balance between the scale of the disaster and the personal story at its center. He was particularly impressed by the film's ability to make the audience emotionally invested in the historical tragedy rather than treating the sinking merely as a spectacle. Ebert ultimately ranked Titanic among his top films of 1997. On Siskel Ebert, the film received the program's celebrated two-thumbs-up verdict, with the critics praising Cameron's recreation of the sinking and Leonardo DiCaprio's screen presence. James Berardinelli similarly responded enthusiastically to the film's enormous scale and attention to detail, describing it as the kind of major cinematic event that had become increasingly rare. He emphasized that Titanic was not simply a film to observe but an immersive theatrical experience, particularly because Cameron combined elaborate production design and visual effects with a narrative designed to place the viewer inside the unfolding catastrophe. Berardinelli ranked the film as his second-best movie of 1997. Joseph McBride of Box Office magazine also praised Cameron's achievement, arguing that describing Titanic merely as a disaster movie understated its significance. He regarded the film as a major piece of serious popular entertainment and admired the scale and ambition with which Cameron reconstructed the doomed ocean liner and the events surrounding its final hours. The film's emotional and romantic dimensions were also frequently singled out from praise. And Roel Urban of Urban Cinephile argued that audiences